two maxims of business. Number one, the customer is always right. And number two, the goal of the corporation is to provide profits for the shareholder. I mean, that's the way I grew up knowing. That's what I learned when I went to business school, when I studied for my CFA. You always want to serve your customers. Of course, successful companies take care of their employees, they take care of the environment, they're good corporate citizens. But rule number one is customer is right, and rule number two is you make a profit. But something's changed. That's no longer the case in corporate America. And that's for that reason, we brought in a colleague, someone I work with on a couple of coalitions, trying to make sure that corporate America is doing the right thing for both for America, but also for their shareholders and everything else. And that's my friend Stephen Sukup. And he's written an incredible new book. The title of the book is The Dictatorship of Woke Capital. Welcome, Stephen, to the Economic War Room.
Thank you very much for having me, Kevin. I appreciate it.
Hey, so that's a provocative title. Dictatorship, woke capital. Can you explain the terms?
Well, it is a dictatorship. When I discuss the idea of woke capital, what I have in mind is a top-down, anti-democratic use of American business by some of the best-known men and women in American business to change not only the way capitalism functions, but also to change the fundamental relationship between the state and its citizens. And that's an enormous deal, and it is, in fact, in practice, dictatorial. The actual title itself was the title given, The Dictatorship of Woke Capital was a title given by First Things magazine to the speech that Senator Tom Cotton made on the floor of the U.S. Senate 2 years ago in response to Hollywood's actions against the people of Georgia. And so it's a term that is evolving, but it's most definitely a dictatorship.
Well, but the dictatorship is not with the people who own the shares. The owners of the corporation, we've always been taught, are the shareholders. And I'm a shareholder in a lot of companies, and I'm telling you, a lot of those companies are not doing what the majority of the shareholders want. So who's grabbing the power here?
Well, the woke influence usually comes from one of three directions. It can come from the bottom up, which is woke employees pressuring their companies to take an activist stand. It can come from the top down, which is the C-suite pushing woke activism on the corporation, and it can come from the outside in. And usually when we talk about actions from the outside in, what we're talking about are activist shareholders. The squeaky wheel gets the grease is the old adage, and that applies to shareholders as well. The majority of shareholders may disapprove of the use of their capital for woke purposes, but the activists, the loud ones, and some of the more prominent ones are the ones who are able to push their agenda.
One of the problems we've seen is the fact that people are no longer direct investors in their company. They either go through an index fund or a mutual fund of some kind, BlackRock being one of the largest of these, where when you make an investment, you buy into the S&P 500, and you don't really know that that investment is going into Disney or Coca-Cola or Facebook or any of the other members of the S&P 500. But yet, you're the shareholder, you're the owner, there's an intermediary there. What role do they play?
Well, they play an enormous role. BlackRock has in the neighborhood of $9 trillion in assets under management. Vanguard has roughly $7 trillion in assets under management, and all of that is passive. And then you add in State Street with another $5 trillion, and what you're talking about is well over $20 trillion in assets managed passively by companies that have taken an overt public stance declaring that they wish for sustainability and other social goals to be their primary investment directives. So what you have are these companies taking investors' money and leveraging it to advance their political ends.
Yeah, well, I like sustainability. I think that's a great concept, but it's all comes down to the definition. What do they mean when they're saying sustainability?
What they mean when they say sustainability is climate change. They want for companies to have a specific plan for how they're going to become carbon neutral, how they're going to deal with the decarbonization of the economy, and how they're going to help save the world from this scourge that they see coming just over the horizon.
You know, this has been building for a long time, but something broke to make this the dominant force on Wall Street. When did that happen, and what was it that all of a sudden made this this change to where Wall Street is now a leftist, globalist cabal, literally controlling the American economy? What happened and when?
You know, I think that the change probably came somewhere around the turn of this century. A conglomeration of factors sort of hit the street about that time. The social investment movement began probably a couple decades earlier with the student response to apartheid in South Africa. The students protested, asked their schools to divest from South Africa, and that formed the foundation of modern socially responsible investing, which was actually a wonderful thing. For the first 20 years or so, it was a bipartisan endeavor whereby you could choose to invest in alignment with your values. As an individual investor or as an institutional investor, you took the risk of lower return on investment in order to have the personal peace of mind of knowing that your investments were in alignment with your values. Somewhere around the year 2000, though, the UN gets very aggressive with climate change, its climate change agenda, the democratization of the markets throughout the 1990s, in part because of the delayed effect of 401ks and in part because of the boom of the 1990s. There are more people involved. And so I think there's, as I said, there are a significant number of factors that all sort of merged at the beginning of this century that pushed what was a noble and understandable investment tool into something a little bit considerably less benign.
We're going to need to take a break. When we come back, though, I'd like you to talk about some of the most egregious examples of things being shoved down investors' throats. Let's take a break and we'll be back. Welcome back. We've been talking with Stephen Sukup, who's the author of a great book, The Dictatorship of Woke Capital, which covers so many of the things we've talked about ESG, all in one place. And really, it's a strong read and a good way you can introduce others to this dreadful concept that's being shoved down our throats. And I want to ask you, Stephen, what you work with institutional investors, what do they think about this trend?
Well, a lot of them were surprised by it, as a matter of fact. I started in the institutional research business in 1996. I started at Prudential Securities in their award-winning Washington office. And ironically enough, my boss, the managing director of that office, Mark Melcher, he and I were blown out of Prudential in 2000 because the CEO of our parent company was not particularly thrilled with what we had written about political corruption, which at the time was Bill Clinton. We spent a couple years at Lehman, and again, we left on our own accord there because we wanted to write about the issues of corruption in the People's Republic of China, and Lehman Brothers bankers didn't want us to discuss that. They didn't want our clients to be informed of what exactly takes place in the PRC.
Let me interrupt you just for a second there, because this is what I think is the worst thing about, we have these woke capital people talking about ESG and we've got to protect the environment, and yet they turn right around and invest easily into China without any demands on the Chinese government, which is committing the worst of human atrocities with the Uyghur population and human organ trafficking. They're the worst polluters on the planet, and they have absolutely no corporate governance whatsoever other than the control of the Chinese Communist Party. And they've proven that recently when they yank an IPO just because the supreme dictator Xi doesn't like it. So I think that hypocrisy is something people are not really understanding, but it's really deep. And I'm glad that you were jumping on the Chinese Communist Party as early as you were. For some reason, and for the life of me, I can't imagine why, our editors in New York did not particularly care for us referring to their banking clients as the butchers of Beijing. For the life of me, I can't figure out why that bothered them. But so we started our own firm, an independent research provider, about 17 years ago, specifically because we wanted to be able to be honest with our clients and not have to worry about what the investment bank would say or about what the bosses in New York would want to tell us. About 2 years ago, I had a conversation with our mutual friend, Justin Danhoff, about what he's doing and how lonely his fight against shareholder activism is. And despite the fact that, as I say, I've worked at the nexus of Washington and Wall Street for almost 25 years, what he told me shocked me. And then what I turned around and told my clients, who are experienced institutional investors, what I told them shocked them. So this was something that at that point it occurred to me that not only was it serious, but it was serious and nobody knew about it. It was something that people weren't paying any attention to. They were happy to use the proxy advisory services and to take their advice without ever thinking about the fact that they might be biased in their own right. And so it's something that we believe that we had to raise awareness about, and that's what the book is. Yeah, well, there are examples almost every day I see, but what are some of the most egregious forms of this woke capital that you've seen that when the people recognize it, it's like, whoa, I didn't know that was happening? Well, it's funny that we should have discussed the People's Republic of China because China plays a significant role in a lot of this. The largest corporation in the world, the largest corporation the world has ever known, Apple, is one of the ESG darlings. And it's an ESG darling for two reasons. And the first is because its CEO Tim Cook is a very aggressive social justice warrior in the United States. He discusses social justice. He gives his money to social justice. He uses corporate funds to support social justice projects. He's very involved. And the other reason that Apple is a huge ESG darling is because they claim to be green. All of Apple's corporate entities, all of its corporate business is now officially zero net emissions. So they're very proud of the fact that they're the greenest company in the world. Of course, when you take the trip halfway around the world to the People's Republic of China, you learn a couple of things. You learn, first of all, that Apple would not be where it is without the aid of the Chinese Communist Party. And the Chinese Communist Party would not be as solid as it is now without the help of Apple.
The two have worked hand in hand over the last 2 decades to provide what the other needed. The CCP needed good jobs for its large and growing single male population. Apple provided those jobs. Apple needed relatively cheap labor and a place to put together all of these phones. China provided that for them. So over the last 2 decades, Tim Cook has invested heavily in China. With respect to human rights over there, it's fairly well known and famous couple of incidents over the past couple of years where the government in Beijing asked Apple to remove apps that were being used by the rebels in Hong Kong from the App Store because they didn't want the rebels to have access to these apps because it made their rebellion easier. And Apple complied. Additionally, what you find is that Apple's green status is mostly a fake because the overwhelming majority of the energy expended on creating, building, transporting, and selling Apple products is actually done by their contractors who are located in Taiwan and the PRC, and they're in no way, shape, or form green. So it's a major sort of duality here that is a con, more or less, on the ESG investor. The other company that comes to mind right away is BlackRock, which, as I said, is pushing sustainability, but for most of the last 10 or 15 years has also been the largest shareholder of PetroChina, which is the listed arm of the Chinese National Petroleum Company, which not only is, a petroleum company and was at one point in time the largest corporation in the world, but also has had human rights issues.
I'm going to have to interrupt you. We're going to have to take another break. I want to hear more about this when we come back, and also some solutions. What can we do about it? So let's take a break. Welcome back. Where we left off was with the author Stephen Sukup, who's been in the industry a long time, understands the risk of woke capital. In fact, he wrote a book on it. We were talking about BlackRock, Larry Fink, and how they were invested in PetroChina. So let me go right back to it, Stephen.
Well, as I said, PetroChina was at one point the largest corporation in the world, the largest petroleum company in the world, and it was the Chinese National Petroleum Company had some issues, and these are issues that we worked on a little bit back in 2000 with Frank Gaffney and Roger Robinson, where PetroChina and the Chinese National Petroleum Company were providing financial assistance to the regime in Sudan that was trading, that was involved in the modern day slave trade. They were capturing, auctioning, selling black slaves in Khartoum. And PetroChina was one of the companies that was sanctioned for supporting the regime. And yet Larry Fink, who is our moral scold, was, his firm was the largest holder of PetroChina for a long time. I don't believe they are now, but for many years they were.
It doesn't sound very woke to me. I mean,
No.
it really doesn't. Now, there's even closer to home. There are some instances, just came out the story, Coca-Cola it had employee training where they're telling their employees to be less white. And yet that gets out, and the customer's like, what is that about? I mean, that sounds like abject racism on its face. Why would Coke do that?
I think Coke probably would do that because A, they were confident that it would never get out. That's the arrogance of a lot of these woke C-suite types. And because they probably got a lot of pressure from the bottom up from some of their employees. As I said, the pressure on a lot of these companies comes from three directions. And I imagine they got a lot of pressure from the bottom up.
Wow. It just seems like, again, the customer is always right, and the goal of a company is to make money, following all the rules and regulations of society. Those are just being completely ignored.
Yeah, the woke capitalists ignore all sorts of things. They ignore the history of the movement that they're involved in. They ignore the history of the companies and the people they deride. They ignore what the virtues of capitalism are. It's a very closed moral mindset, and it's eventually going to cause serious problems.
Well, they're doing it in conjunction with both Washington and Wall Street and the Chinese government and the globalists. I mean, it seems like it's a fascist oligarchy that's forming, where the companies do the bidding of the government and the government does the bidding of the companies, and the shareholders and the real owners are left out in the cold.
Yeah, absolutely. I wrote a piece a couple weeks ago where I took somebody in the media had compared our current state to corporatism. And I said that it's actually worse than corporatism because corporatism implies that the collusion between government and business is at least being run by the government. What we have is a corporatocracy, which is the collusion between business and government, but where government is subservient to the corporations. So the corporations are in charge, and they're essentially imposing their will on us from the top down.
And it's corporate elitists who are in charge. It's not the people who actually
Absolutely.
own the corporations. So
No. That's, again, as with the passive asset managers, these are people who are leveraging the wealth invested in their companies by average Americans to advance their political beliefs.
So what do we do about it? I mean, I know what we're doing. Economic War Room, we've started the National Security Investment Consultant Institute. If you have a financial advisor, a client-facing advisor, and you want your money to represent your values and not somebody else, not some Wall Street elitist values, then you tell your stockbroker, your financial planner. And the problem is, the first thing they'll say is, I don't know how to address that. So we've got a whole training program, and if you want to nominate your advisor, you go to economicwarroom.com/advisor, give us the name of the advisor, we'll contact him or her and say, hey, here's our training. So I know what we're doing. We're trying to collect 10,000 trained advisors representing $1 trillion of capital to make a difference. And by the way, Stephen, you would be fantastic having you use, we're going to use your book as part of the curriculum. It's a great book, but would you come and join us in that effort? We'll have you as one of our featured speakers.
I'd be happy to. Anything I can do to help. And when you ask me what I think the solutions are, what you're doing is what I think is step 2 in the number of solutions that I offer. The first step, obviously, is to raise awareness. As I said before, I have clients who have been in the business for 40 and 50 years who are unaware of how severe this problem is. And these are professionals. So if the professionals were unaware of what's going on and how serious it is, then you can imagine that the average investor, the average Main Street investor, is even less likely to know. And we need to raise awareness among them. We need to get them to understand who is doing this and why they're doing this. And then step 2, what you're doing is to push for a more effective and more value-laden use of our wealth.
That's great. Well, your book raises awareness, number 1, and it's fantastic. Do you have a copy of your book there you can hold up for the camera? I ordered mine. I ordered mine on Amazon. Then I also bought the Kindle so I could read it. There it is, The Dictatorship of Woke Capital. I am proud to say I was one of the first reviewers of it on Amazon. Fantastic book. Every viewer of Economic War Room should get it. Every financial advisor should get it and read it. You're doing a tremendous thing. I think the third thing, and we're going to bring Justin Danoff in on our next show. We've had him on before. We'll talk about how you can use the proxies and you can vote your values and whether or not you divest, which is what some people think, or whether or not you get involved. And we're doing a little bit of both. So our training at Liberty University, we've got experts. If you want to talk space, we'll have Lieutenant General Stephen Quast or Rod Martin, who was one of the founders at PayPal, part of the founding team. Or we'll have great military leaders, great economic leaders, great business people explaining all these. But you will be a great addition to our faculty since you said you'll join us. So
I'd be happy to help any way I can.
Any last words, Stephen, for our audience?
Well, as I said, the most important thing is to be aware of this and to see it. It's everywhere. Once you're aware of what's happening, you see it everywhere. It's Coca-Cola, it's Disney. It's Disney telling Jim Henson's heirs that he was problematic, despite the fact that Jim Henson is the man who made Sesame Street run, and Sesame Street was a specifically geared toward early education program for minority children.
That's just amazing.
It's all over, and it's just so destructive.
They banned the Muppets. That's amazing. Well, yeah. We're at the end here, but I want to say thank you, Stephen, so much. And I want to tell our audience, remember, what we see as a marketplace, our enemies view as a battle space. Get your free economic battle plan at economicwarroom.com. This is Kevin Freeman from the Economic War Room.